Hello everyone, today I've been busy so I haven't prepared any history video and I go on with Von Clausewitz and tomorrow will quite likely will be the same, but don't worry about that. I think these chapters are equally useful for what we're talking about. You know how much importance I give to Von Clausewitz and his thinking. So today we read the fourth paragraph of the first chapter, the first book of Von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, which is called "The Aim is to Disarm the Enemy." Also, this time we skip the read in German. We go straight to the English. Let's make it quick, but nevertheless, I remind you that the best option and kind of the mandatory option, especially if you're going to do something serious with Von Kriege, is to read it from the original. And so many things cannot be understood but from the original, I mean in the original language. So here I read and we go. The aim is to disarm the enemy. We have already said that the aim of all action in war is to disarm the enemy, and we shall now show that this, theoretically at least, is indispensable. If our opponent is to be made to comply with our will, we must place him in a situation which is more oppressive to him than the sacrifice which we demand. But the advantages of this position must naturally not be of a transitory nature, at least in appearance, otherwise the enemy, instead of yielding, will hold out in the prospect of a change for the better. Every change in this position which is produced by a continuation of the war should therefore be a change for the worse. The worst condition in which a belligerent can be placed is that of being completely disarmed. If, therefore, the enemy is to be reduced to submission by an act of war, he must either be positively disarmed or placed in such a position that is threatened with it. From this, it follows that the disarming or overthrow of the enemy, whichever we call it, must always be the aim of warfare. Now, war is always the shock of two hostile bodies in collision, not the action of a living power upon an inanimate mass, because an absolute state of endurance would not be making war. Therefore, what we have just said as to the aim of action in war applies to both parties. Here, then, is another case of reciprocal action. As long as the enemy is not defeated, he may defeat me. Then I shall be no longer my own master. He will dictate the law to me as I did to him. This is the second reciprocal action and leads to a second extreme. Second reciprocal action. So, as you understand, this Von Clausewitz here follows. If if you have listened to the previous paragraphs where we talk about recently, it's just following his logical chain, and he's dedicating this paragraph to the aim to disarm the enemy in war. We have seen that fundamentally the objective of war at this point is to disarming the enemy, because that's the only way fundamentally that kind of obliterates the capacity for our opponent to resist our will. So this is crucial in order to achieve, and in this paragraph especially, Von Clausewitz explicitly says that is showing us why disarming the enemy is indispensable. So he says, in fact, we have already said that the aim of all action in war is to disarm the enemy. To disarm the enemy, simply as that. And we shall now show that this, theoretically at least, is indispensable. Always bear in mind, I say this every single time, theory and practice in Von Clausewitz are kind of indestructible. Now, they cannot be separated in any way. Now, however, Von Clausewitz is fundamentally talking about these first principles that are extremely important, and at least in general terms, these are mostly theoretically oriented chapters. Nevertheless, there is always a reflection of this that obviously is shown ahead in the work, that, however, can be observed by mere reason throughout what he's saying. the adverb theoretically is very important in here to show that the aim of war is to disarm the enemy indispensably, because there might be as well a war into which you cannot practically lead to the full disarmament of the enemy, but this is contingental. So that's why von Clausewitz is stressing the theoretical side of it, because this is basically how the Clausewitz in theory works, and why it's so, it differentiates so much from the others, one of his contemporaries, and remains fundamentally unchallenged, because it's always showing you how the theory works, and then the practice goes is on another level. They work in the same way, but the work, the theory naturally not always, reflects it fully on practice. Or better, it is always reflected on practice, but practice has this kind of relative contingencies for which you may find situations that are extremely different one from the other. Well, the theory is working all the time into this, but naturally the contingental factor brings you time after time to essentially respond accordingly to the situation. Great part of this theoretically is explained naturally, as we've seen also in the previous paragraph, by the obvious the statement that, of course, war as an act of violence is always in some way modified or controlled by politics. So war is a mere instrument of politics, and therefore if politics dictates another direction, war is fundamentally to be to obey accordingly. Not always, in the sense that war can fundamentally war has someone else who is fighting also from the other side, so you might not control that, and war can unleash, let's say, as can expand, it can be uncontrolled. You may in fact lose control of your situation and being defeated at the end of the day, but that's the point. If you take war alone, here you have the theory, but never war is never alone in reality by definition. So that's why von Clausewitz stresses the theoretically, because in here he's talking specifically about war, especially now these paragraphs. So he shows us why the disarmament of the enemy is indispensable. He says, if our opponent is to be made to comply with our will, which is the first objective in war, we must place him in a situation which is more oppressive to him than the sacrifice which we demand. So this is very important. It's a kind of a mathematical relation. Fundamentally, you are obliging someone to accept a certain condition to avoid a worse condition. Let's assume you attack an enemy, and you attack someone, and you want to steal from him a 2 in terms of resources, as a number, as a quantity. Well, if you put him in the condition of risking to lose not 2 but 4, and this is quite likely to happen, well, at that point your enemy, obviously if you have the upper hand on him and you can impose him in this sense, this effect, will fundamentally say, okay, I stop resisting, because if what I foresee basically to lose is higher than what than what I can retain if I don't oppose any resistance, now things will, I will accept this. Naturally, I'm making it relatively simple for many reasons. Now, this reminds me what we were saying in the previous paragraph, when it says that, I mean, if these relations fundamentally were to be those relations were to be understood since the very beginning, every governmental action wouldn't even require war, because everything would be calculated as if it was an algebraic um, calculation. Fundamentally, that's what von Clausewitz defines it like. So, also my example was ultra theoretical, too abstract in this sense. Obviously, the at this point, if you resist, it's because, in fact, von Clausewitz, if you listen now, he said it in the following phrases. If the enemy fundamentally prospects a change for the better, so that this situation might be very harsh now, but then things can change for the better and can even be reversed, he will probably go on. And naturally, in the uncertainty of war, this can happen many times, and that's why this kind of oppressive situation is very important, because it's at least in appearance, von Clausewitz says, something that should scare the enemy at the point he doesn't know what to do, and fundamentally convincing him to give up, hopefully. Now, in this paragraph, von Clausewitz doesn't talk specifically about how this happens, but you understand that this has a lot to do with many factors into a real war, especially. An extraordinarily clamorous defeat can be, can, for instance, wipe out the moral resources of a system that maybe could face the same amount of losses, but on a longer period of time. Von Clausewitz actually makes a point like this when he is talking, in fact, about how to inflict this hit on the enemy. You can have the same amount of losses, but it's going to be enormously more effective on the morale, and therefore on the will to keep on fighting, if this happens all at once, rather than if it happens, very gradually in a given time. So this is kind of easy to understand. So and this von Clausewitz says, we must place the enemy in a situation which is more oppressive to him than the sacrifice which we demand. So you understand how all the times in military history, fundamentally, wars of annihilation, first of all, kind of rare, relatively rare, at least up to a certain time in history. Really wiping out a whole state or other political entity is kind of difficult, and there is, virtually never the complete annihilation of an enemy. So we assume that even in the defeat, even when a regime is overthrown or something, that country, that society fundamentally goes on living. So you can make the society surrender fundamentally just to maintain something for it, not just vanishing into nothingness, but having to live on. So you essentially, this side is always making a kind of calculation that you also make when you're an attacker. Even if you have the upper hand, you may meet a resistance that is kind of harder than you expect, and even if you may reasonably win the military clash, you still, for certain political and social reasons, have no need to spend so much resources into that. This is also typical. So this is the real point. If you really want to oblige your enemy to comply to your will, you must place him in this situation which is more demanding, more oppressive to him at the moment than the sacrifice which you demand. And fundamentally, as we'll see now, not giving hope that this will change in some way. So this is just an economical, even mathematical consideration. I'm losing more than what I would lose if I surrender. So that's and disarm myself, therefore, and render my arms. So, and in fact, von Clausewitz stresses this the aspect of the the certainty of this loss. I mean, it is something that must be prolonged over time, not to make it fundamentally just transitory. Because it says, but the disadvantages of this position must naturally not be of transitory nature, at least in appearance. Otherwise, the enemy, instead of yielding, will hold out in the prospect of a change for the better. This is particularly important. If you feel oppressed, but you still somehow have the hope that things will go better, naturally there will be some odds, so there will be some calculations. Every war has some odds. Very rarely you can foretell, very rarely there are wars into which one of the sides is automatically going to lose. And this is particularly important to understand, because many people would say, well, but there were certain wars where historically speaking, where there was someone who could not win, fundamentally. This is a bit kind of very theoretical, and it's a mistake that many people do, even when you look at those shows like The Deadliest Warrior, for instance, because you take into consideration fundamentally just the material side of the story. Who is the strongest? We have the strongest military. Who can? It's as if it was just an iron arm of pure violence, of pure force. But war is never like that, because from the other side you have someone who is controlling this act of violence and modifying and modulating it according to the situation for reasons that ultimately have not to do with how effective your army is. That's the same example. It's ridiculous to think that, I don't know, the Romans didn't have, for instance, the men and material to occupy and maintain Scotland, but they simply didn't do it because it was not convenient for them. They didn't have enough pros to balance with the cons. So they said, okay, in this situation, you know what, we don't care. We could crush these guys, but we don't have any particular interest to do it, because we would lose too much than what we need. And this is fundamentally how wars are really fought. So this thing of holding out that von Clausewitz stresses is very important, because there are countless examples into military history of David beating Goliath. I mean, great military powers that are practically bogged down even by things like guerrilla, that must not be underestimated, because guerrilla is actually a strong form of warfare, and by entities that are evidently weak. So at that point it's not really guerrilla winning physically over the giant, it's simply the giant deciding that it costs too much. The Vietnam War is a brilliant example of that. It's not that the Americans didn't have the means or the ability to wipe out the whole North Vietnam and to crush it, but they simply, at that point, it costed too much. Public opinion said, okay, we don't want to do this anymore, and they withdrew the forces. But it's naive to believe that they would have not made it, also because the Americans literally won every single battle on the field, ultimately losing the war. So this is that's a beautiful example, for instance, because it makes you understand which are the factors that intervene into this. Just like, I don't know, the British Empire during the War of American Revolution. It's not that really the American revolutionaries won just because of guerrilla, because of their rifles and so on. Obviously, there were other powers involved that sided with them. The War of American Revolution was won in the Atlantic Ocean, telling you the truth, not on the American soil. But at a certain point, the Brits saw that it was too costly, even for a sheer logistical reason, to bring all the troops from Britain, from the United Kingdom into North America to fight in there. So they said, okay, we go bankrupt if they do this, let's give up. And this is how history goes. So you see here that von Clausewitz draws an absolute of theory, but the practice of warfare, how it happens in political and military terms, is always more modulated. You don't have the total annihilation of an entire military machine. This is a very rare evenience, a very rare eventuality, and even the same act of surrendering doesn't mean in fact that you have crushed the entire military machine. It's just like how the Americans, for instance, destroyed the Wehrmacht during World War II. I mean, at a certain point, while the Germans basically held till the very last man against the Soviets, because they hoped that even in defeat they would fundamentally still fit into the Western world and not under communism. On the Rhine, on the rest of Germany, of course, the Germans still fought in some harsh way, but many divisions at that point surrendered. So there was no need for the Americans at that point to literally wipe out those entire divisions. They simply surrendered, and that's the point. You have to put the enemy into a condition which you basically don't make it. You make it too costly to keep on fighting, and this naturally can, people tend, I believe, especially from a sheer cinematographical, literary perspective, to always analyze the perspective of the single individual, what it takes, even this idea of sacrifice, till death, etc. But, great political and military systems are much more fragile things. Individual courage can be boundless, but, altogether you realize that also here a very few armies, historically speaking, are literally annihilated on the field. They simply melt apart because they don't have any support, very often logistical support. They don't have means to sustain themselves, so many soldiers surely don't want to die. Most soldiers don't just want to save their skin. So at a certain point, okay, as long as you can fight, fine, then you surrender. And even the idea of surrendering is kind of natural. There is always this moment in which you get to the point which is kind of senseless to fight by certain standards. It's always something that pertains fundamentally to the individual, to his moral, fundamentally, system, to his ethics, as you want to say. But we observe, generally speaking, in history that this happens, kind of, in spite of the differences of beliefs, of morale, or what can make the soldier remaining on the field longer than it's even convenient. Generally speaking, if you look at the broader level, armies at a certain point simply melt away because they do not have the system. So at a broader level, so looking at also the majority of the elements that make up that army, you tend to surrender at the very end because it's senseless to go on fighting. This is also very important to make you understand the nature of combat, as von Clausewitz states. The point here is not, in fact, to annihilate physically the enemy. It's simply to disarm him, and this can happen theoretically, at least in through this. Happens through this. Then what I wanted to say is that there may be multiple reasons that have not strictly to do, in fact, with the military aspect that will make that person surrender. It can be everything: political, social, cultural, religious, everything that makes up what also war is influenced by. This is very important to understand, I believe. I believe that this last point of essentially put the enemy under pressure he considers to be, at least apparently, from which there is apparently no way out, and therefore it's better to give up, is naturally strictly connected with what we have seen in the previous chapter, the one on the utmost use of force, because here it says, in fact, if you don't do this, if you don't put the enemy such a pressure, instead of yielding, he will hold out in the prospect of a change for the better. So what we read in the previous paragraph, the one on the utmost use of force, number 3, explains. It's strictly interconnected with this one, because in that paragraph, von Clausewitz was essentially stating that when you have to use violence, in theory, it's better if you use it at its maximum, because otherwise, fundamentally, you will give the possibility of the enemy to react, to hold on, to think that this will end in a certain way. So this, particular note that von Clausewitz makes, saying at least an appearance, so you have at least in that specific moment to make the enemy feel this oppression to be endurable. unendurable. Sorry. So here that's where the utmost use of force is so important, because you can't concentrate this force on a single. The more this force is concentrated, and the stronger it is fundamentally, and the more this situation will be unbearable at that moment. And this thing of the appearance is not only strictly related to this, but it's kind of still part of it, because most of the times you fundamentally do not know who is hitting you, especially from a strictly, there is some certain chaotic. There's such a chaotic dimension sometimes in the moment of an attack, that there are so many other factors that hit so much on your morale, for which a big enemy offensive at that point, you don't know whether it's gonna end. You're scared. You fear it. You don't know what's going on. So the utmost use of force is what you should use at all time in this situation, to make the enemy resistance break immediately, as soon as you can, because in proportion, even if you use the same amount of force, but kind of in a diluted way over time, this could be less effective. So it's always better to kind of concentrate this, and to make the enemy believe that this condition is fundamentally not going to end. Now it's interesting, because humans are kind of, if they're very easy to put under pressure, especially not just from a physical point of view, but also from a psychological point of view, so that there are certain things that cannot be endured at the moment. Well, if you want to avoid more prolonged bloodshed, and you want just to hit hard at that moment, maybe cause a hell of damage, to destroy, etc., well, that would be the preferable option. You don't want this force to go disperse, and not to hit the hardest exactly where it's needed to make the enemy crumble at that point. That's also more effective. It's a physical concept fundamentally. You can resist, you can absorb force which is more the same amount of force when it's diluted. It's kind of obvious. It's like sectioned. It's fragmented. You can and that this has to do also with the concept of offensive. It has to be concentrated. We'll see it written from Clausewitz. But nevertheless, you don't have to give the enemy hope of resisting. And these very hard blows are a very effective way to achieve it. Then von Clausewitz says, every change in this position, which is produced by a continuation of the war, should therefore be a change for the wars. Naturally, for the enemy. So this is very important, because from the other side there are also some problems, because the offensive, even a devastating offensive, can even consume an enormous amount of resources. So not necessarily, especially when you absorb kind of the best shot of the enemy, and you say, is this the best you can do? Then you should be able to go on with that kind of offensive. So paradoxically, most of the times actually offensive should be kind of and is, just look at military history, is kind of diluted. So you should find, because otherwise it could be kind of more difficult to deliver in some way. It's always better to have reserves of energy in some way to control what's the situation like, and to react accordingly. The enemy is not always passive. I mean, if it was always passive, it would be kind of good to maybe hit at the strongest you can, but the enemy can strike back. So you also have to save your energies and to store them in some way, and therefore to reduce even kind of the utmost use of force given these conditions. But the theory doesn't change. because what we explain now is contingental, while the utmost use of force is not, for how a war happens. And this naturally happens at so many levels. Can happen at platoon level, at a squad level, and at a division level, so that this happens constantly in combat, in the fight. Remember that von Clausewitz defines war essentially as a duel, so there is fundamentally no difference between two single humans fighting against each other in two states, fundamentally, because the nature of the fight is always the same, and this is valid at every level. There is no stage into which this is fundamentally different. So you should fundamentally equilibrate your force in order to deliver this constant change for the wars. This is important because let's assume you attack the enemy. As we have said, you first of all, it's very hard to hit the enemy, especially at the beginning. Well, when his forces are kind of fresh. Just think if you're in a fight. You would think maybe, now I can knock this guy down just with one hit, because I do it in a way he doesn't plan it. But there might be so many contingent factors that you do not expect. You may not know, especially how the enemy is ready to meet you, for instance, to how he is, what his resources are, what his forces are. This is particularly difficult to assess. So in this case, even the same act of launching this offensive entails that you have to stay, to reduce in part the attack. The attack is always kind of more wavering than the defense. By theory, this is also very important, so that you can always kind of fall back in case things go wrong, because you're the one who is venturing, who is making practically more effort, at least in theory. You're committing more energy, so you're the one, especially if you have the upper hand, who should dose this force, ergonomically speaking, in a way that you can basically keep the enemy constantly under pressure at a level that allows you to make this change for the worse continuous. If you see it from the side of the defender, let's say, you basically should find it, and this also naturally has to do whether was weaker, was stronger, because you may not be so strong, in fact, to defeat someone. So that's really a point. But assuming that this guy is weaker, what you're giving him the impression like is where you're keeping to beat him and hit him, and things are getting worse because this person is getting wounded. I now say a person can be an army. Naturally, I'm not making a case you should go out there and fight someone, but it's just making you a more even an example. So that once you take 1, 2, 3 fists, you basically are not in a better shape than you were beginning on the fight. So this situation is going worse for you, and this is creating complications, because not only war is destructive. We have seen how von Clausewitz stresses the kind of very physical dimension of war, this idea of complete destruction. So being hit is not just like in video games where you have a bar of health and things go more or less practically the same way until the bar reaches 0. In the process in which your health is decreasing, you're feeling increasingly worse, and this is what you should be able to inflict over your enemy, so that you basically give him no quarter, of course, but more especially you're making him understand, you're making him suffer in a fashion that his mind is focused on is, I'm going down, I'm losing energies, I can't make it. And these are all things we will see when von Clausewitz speaks very well and very thoroughly about the concept of attack and defense. But this is, however, the general idea. You can't make a hit that is just a show off. I mean, that could. I mean, I don't want to make this absolute, because von Clausewitz would kill me. You can. Maybe there are certain operations in which victory is achieved by just making this big show off at the beginning and knocking the enemy out immediately. Other times you just have to keep on this pressure, measuring it. Whatever it is, you should always make this enemy believe, at least believe, in appearance, von Clausewitz says, that things are gonna get worse. So this is also why sometimes this simulation, for instance, is so important, because you may sometimes wanna really hit the hardest at one point because that's your best shot, for instance, and then you have no other means to go on. Just think about the something we discussed about on Schwerpunkt already, the charges of the ancient barbarians, the Celts, the Germans. Why did the Celts and the Germans attack so much en masse? And with this idea that they had to knock out the enemy at the first hit because they were tougher than the others, they could exploit this better. No, of course not. The real these were fundamentally the same human beings that it could be found from the other side. But they did this because in that case their biggest problem was logistics. Not having centralized political entities with permanent armies, effective logistical systems, they could gather fundamentally that certain amount of few amount of resources that were needed that could last for a short time. So the idea was, let's attack. This will exhaust soon because we don't have an efficient system that can resupply us. So the best thing to do is to attack at the first time, and with this devastating charge that should wipe anything out. So in that case, for instance, that is an example of one big shot at the beginning, taunting the enemy, showing off, having all this physicality involved that has not much physical effects but rare psychological ones, and that's why those peoples fought in that way. That's why the Romans instead fought the other way, because they had more resources to spend on the long run, and therefore they prefer to stay not only just on the defensive, of course, but just being more calm, to maintain the value of discipline, to deliver better the single energies that they had in that specific favorable context of the fight, etc. And because they had the means to do it that way, to act more intelligently, let's say, in that way, not just with a big shot. And the Romans are not famous for extremely violent charges. Why? Because they didn't need them. So you realize how this is reciprocal, how one army behaves in a way because there is one valid reason that, even if it's not rationalized, however, brings societies to organize into that fashion, and vice versa. And not vice versa, but other societies would do in another way. So this is very important to understand, because this also dictates the way combat develops. Not all combats are equal. Not all armies are equal. Not all fighters are equal. They're always different. War is asymmetrical by definition. Never trust those journalists who, say the term asymmetrical every 3 seconds because they equate asymmetrical to, guys who do not fight like, modern Western armies do. Because that doesn't mean anything. War is asymmetrical by definition. At best you can, kind of realize how different the systems are. But it's a relative term. It's not an absolute term, as you hear it expressed sometimes. Anyhow, now we digressed a little bit. Then von Clausewitz adds, the worst condition in which a belligerent can be placed is that of being completely disarmed. Now, this is self-evident, but nevertheless is important to reflect on it. In absolute terms, the worst condition in which a belligerent can be placed is that of being completely disarmed. Now, being completely disarmed here, you don't have to imagine it just, the individual who, I don't know, has no ammo anymore, can't fight. You have to imagine it kind of also the broader level as well. I mean, that works also for the individual soldier, of course, but being disarmed can mean different things at those different stages of what we're talking about. Single soldiers, entire armies, entire countries, and so on. But also the processes through which being disarmed, more importantly, the processes through which this happens can be different. You can be disarmed, for instance, because you give up, because you have no will to fight again. Maybe you have your weapons loaded, but you're morally wasted. So in that sense, you're disarmed, because even if you have a rifle in your hand, you can't even shoot it. And believe me, this happens really often in war. So being disarmed other times simply means, I ran out of ammo, so I'm effectively disarmed. Also here, the concept of being disarmed can get really relative in military history, because being disarmed is kind of difficult, because kind of every person can be potentially offensive, as long as you can bite, kick, and punch, you can be armed in this sense. But naturally, by the approximation, we say that, think about, I don't know, France, when it was conquered by the Germans in 1940. Yeah, okay, there was resistance and so on, but effectively France was disarmed. France, once conquered, is also kind of relatively easy to control, because of how the country is, morphologically built, how the centers are disposed, the main roads, etc. So there are certain factors to which an army a whole country can be disarmed, for instance, just by sheer deterrence. And we have seen many times in history how it was consistently more difficult to disarm a country in the Middle Ages than it was today, because today weapons have a kind of a higher deterrent effect. So what you could control very difficultly just with sword and arrow back in the day, now just with a rifle you can even multiply for 10 or 20, just throwing random numbers in here, but just to give the dimensions and sometimes how easy it is to control a disarmed population. And believe me, this is easy. Naturally, also in here you cannot fully disarm a people. And there is guerrilla, there is resistance, etc. But this should be also a kind of admonition for all those people who think that theoretically a country can simply oppose in non-violent ways, even without weapons, and make it. It's not really how it works. You really need a certain degree of control, at least on certain mechanisms, in order to achieve that. And sometimes this was not possible, historically speaking. And I'm not saying that this has not to do also with the kind of cooperation that you can have with your occupants, with your conquerors. This happens, but this is yet another proof that the Clausewitzian paradigm of the war as a continuation of politics by other means is true all the times, because that's what it reconfirms. So just imagine, as von Clausewitz is saying now, is completely, if you're completely disarmed, let's make it simple. Just imagine you have someone in front of you with a gun, and you have nothing to defend you with. Now, yeah, theoretically there are people who can disarm others with a gun, but the odds are pretty low, and then naturally, the guy with the gun has a huge edge, and you're completely disarmed or virtually disarmed at this point, because real life, you can say that you're never really fully disarmed.
you can always exercise some form of violence, even minimal, even maybe insignificant in that particular context. But that's the point von Clausewitz is making. This is theory. Then practice, in fact, shows that being completely disarmed is practically impossible. Here, von Clausewitz is making an absolute example. The worst condition, to make you understand what's the extreme here, is that you're completely disarmed, which means, in theory, that you basically cannot even defend yourself. Because attack and defense in this sense are kind of the same, the two faces of the same medal. You basically cannot oppose violence to violence in any way. So you're just passive, you're just taking hits. So von Clausewitz is exemplifying this because he's showing the absolute concept. You don't want to be hit without being able to prevent it. So if you're being aggressed, you're being attacked fundamentally in order to break to give up any resistance, that's when you want to do it. And naturally, in this term, in the same absolute, which is kind of ideal, naturally, you don't have any other choice, because at that point, if you're completely disarmed, the enemy can do literally what he wants with you. But in reality, what you have in here is that maybe you're disarmed in the sense that you don't have enough strength to resist the enemy. So you simply say, okay, I'll give this guy what he wants, if it is something that, after all, is is less costly than what would happen to me if I kept resisting with these meager means that I have to defend myself. So this is pretty evident, pretty simple to understand. And then von Clausewitz goes on and says, if therefore the enemy is to be reduced to submission by an act of war, he must either be positively disarmed or placed in such a position that he is threatened with it. The act of war, as we've seen, is an act of violence fundamentally. So there are two ways. Either you just disarm this guy in some way, putting him in this condition in which he cannot respond, or you threaten this to happen, which is actually the same thing in still in the realm of, well, okay, it's not really the same thing, because the first one is entailing that you actually bring that person to be to be brought in that condition in which he cannot physically, let's say, react. The other way is threatening the enemy with that, and the threat, the deterrence in that sense, can also be perceived as kind of bigger or smaller, which means that and that's where the politics and the people kind of play the thing, because the governments may not understand better. I mean, they might not accurately understand what the situation is. Actually, no government ever actually fully 100% understand what the situation is in a war. Nobody does, and nobody ever did, and nobody ever will. But there have been cases in which, of course, you can exercise some pressure on someone without even resorting to violence proper, just making them even think that they are maybe inferior, even if they're not. This is actually very important, because at many times in history there have been situations like that one. Think about the Second Punic War. Now, the Second Punic War was arguably the greatest Roman victory. It's probably the best, if you really want to start to study a military campaign in your life, you have to choose one and only one. Probably the Second Punic War is the best war in military historical terms to study, because it has literally everything about war. It's extremely didactic, it's extremely interesting, not just very historically important, but just really very full and rich. Well, in that situation, as you know, there was a debate internally to the Roman Senate, for which a side, which was, the most open, kind of also Hellenistically oriented, and there was all political and social problems fundamentally. Also, the opening of Rome to the sea, or remaining to agricultural Italy, fundamentally. That from one side, Scipio wanted to bring the war to Africa, which it did. Other Romans were extremely conservative and said, okay, we don't want, because we want the Romans to remain to Italy and not to go out of its borders, its geographical borders. There were many interests because of this, and in that case you realize, for instance, that Rome, at that point, especially after having defeated having basically made Hannibal retreating back to Africa, and having won the Carthaginians in Spain, Rome had a huge advantage at that point. And yet there were certain senators, naturally for political interest and so on, who were pushing for the idea that it was too dangerous, fundamentally. Because back in the day, in the First Punic War, the Romans lost kind of 20 years of war, because they had landed in Africa and they got defeated, and the war raged on for many times. Naturally, that was an anachronism, but there were so many different psychological perceptions of what your strength can be. I think most of the people do not know how strong and weak they can be at a given time. And this is a bit of a great struggle, because it really influences, and that's why also moral resources are so important, and why awareness, knowledge, and consciousness are so important, self-confidence and so on, in everything in life. Because if you think that you can't make it, fundamentally, that something is too difficult for you, you tend to give up. You tend to say, I'm not good for it, and maybe you would be instead, and you don't know it, because you place yourself into a condition of inferiority that it's not really the case. So here Von Clausewitz is stressing indirectly exactly this aspect, that you may not even use an act of violence, engage into an act of violence, in order to make someone curb to your own will and to disarm him. So it's not always something literally physical. There are certain factors for which you can disarm someone without even using violence. What else does he say? So from this, von Clausewitz says, it follows that the disarming or overthrow of the enemy, whichever we call it, must always be the aim of warfare. Which is fundamentally repeating what we have said throughout all the now the third and fourth paragraph. So that the aim of war should be always disarming the enemy. Then he goes on and says, now war is always the shock of two hostile bodies in collision, not the action of a living power upon an inanimate mass, because an absolute state of endurance would not be making war. Therefore, what we have just said as the aim of action in war applies to both parties. Now here he introduces eventually the second, reciprocal action, but let's stop to the first phrase, which is very important. First of all, he says, war is always the shock of two hostile bodies in collision. This is important for two reasons. The first one is kind of more I don't know, not figure eight, but it's very important, because here von Clausewitz defines war as the shock of the two bodies in the two hostile bodies in collision, which is saying fundamentally that until you don't use violence, that's not really war. I mean, what makes war in here is fundamentally the shock, so the physical attrition, let's put it in this way, that, or better, not really, I mean, it's really the physical shock, in fact, of these two bodies colliding. So until these two bodies do not collide, what you have is not really war. We have seen that war is defined by von Clausewitz as an act of violence, which is the use of physical force, fundamentally. So the clash, the physical clash between these two hostile bodies is what really war is. So this is, I don't know why, but I figure this very visually. You know, the idea of the actual destruction which force brings, physically speaking, by definition, is really what war is, in a way or in another. Maybe it's a too physically oriented metaphor, because naturally you can consume resources against someone without even hitting him. But let's say that when war is fought, there is a hell of a shock that is pretty much evident, and that occurs virtually entirely into the phase of combat. So that's really what war is. The second interesting point of this is the continuation of the phrase that says not that the war is always the shock of two hostile bodies in collision, and not the action of a living power upon an inanimate mass. This is also self-explanatory, but incredibly important, because it happens, at least to me, to listen to people saying, okay, let's figure what I have to do when fighting against an enemy. And it seems like, the enemy is always kind of a passive thing you want to attack from the external. It's very video game based as an idea. It's like when you have those characters that are kind of always, that are driven by you, when you have an artificial intelligence from the other side that you find tricks to fundamentally to defeat, because it's kind of always inferior in a certain way. Well, war is real life, unfortunately, and what you have from the other side is always an enemy who is striking back, and that, historically speaking, is always kind of not so extremely different from you at the end of the day, or at least can deliver violence in a kind of a comparable way, the way you do it, because otherwise usually you don't even need really to fight at that point, because it would be too weak to even attempt a fight. So what von Clausewitz was saying before, that even threatening someone of an oppression they cannot endure is enough, fundamentally, to disarm the enemy. So you're not fighting against an inanimate mass. Here, von Clausewitz says it's not the action. War is not the action of a living power upon an inanimate mass. So, really, here it's important that it follows that you're attacking another living power. So it's living power against living power, and therefore you're attacking someone who can strike back, and in a way that you do not necessarily expect, in a way that obliges you, in a way, to suffer that shock of collision that we have seen, because that's the dramatic point. War is not just watching from a third person. You're directly involved into it, so you're always going to suffer the strikes. It's not like iron arm, like not even in there, but it's not like you simply say, okay, who's the strongest? Me. So I take out this guy without difficulty, and I don't consume myself. No, first of all, of course, you can deliver force in a very stupid way and lose if the enemy is incredibly weak, which often happens if you don't have. I mean, it doesn't often happens in military history, but if the average person was put at the head of an army, that could happen really pretty easily. But not only, you're suffering of it. So this entails indirectly that this implies in that you're always gonna lose something in war. You might even gain more, of course, but also in real life, what you lose in a war is not really replaceable. I mean, I would like to make it more theoretical, but more banally and more dramatically and evidently, people who die during wars are gone forever. So you might even win a war and obtain something else. Maybe, trying to balance, but go ask the families of that person who died and ask them whether, it was worth it. And one of the greatest historical problems in many ways now is at all times, is to say, was that war worth it? Because, it's not really easy to assess the losses physically, but especially psychologically speaking. There are wars that are in fact Pyrrhic, as it's usually said, because they, you lost too much, and it's as if at the end of the day, you didn't obtain anything more. Then, of course, things are extremely fluid, so maybe the fruits of what you achieved are, collected over a very long time. But this variation fundamentally alters also the way such things are practically assessed at that specific moment in history. Because maybe the advantages mostly came later, maybe the generation who suffered that war said, okay, this was not worth it, but eventually that is reevaluated after, just like there are certain wars that are maybe seem astonishing victories at the moment, but may even fundamentally lay the basis for a future defeat in some way. Think about, there are many examples. There is no need. I was thinking about France and Germany between the two great wars, the two world wars. That's a pretty good example of what even a victory may not be fully exploited sometimes, which happens pretty often because the winner kind of feels this sense of security at the end of the war, and said that maybe overlooks certain aspects or underestimates the resilience of the foe and stuff like that. So this is also very important, and you understand how many factors can intervene into this, and why assessing certain things, even historically, is so complicated. And why history is so necessary, therefore, because it deals with such problems. They're really big problems, at least ethically speaking. But for what we feel, in fact, is the cost of war has been. Then here, as we were saying, von Clausewitz introduces the second reciprocal action. Here it says, therefore, having said all this, what we have just said as to the aim of action in war applies to both parties. This is pretty evident. Both parties aim to disarm each other. And this is irreversible. We've seen that the first reciprocal action was saying fundamentally the same thing under different points of view, which is fundamentally that violence is pushed to the utmost bounds. So that as one side dictates the law to the other, there arises a sort of reciprocal action, which logically must lead to an extreme. So here it's a bit the same thing. That is, that as long as the enemy is not defeated, von Clausewitz says, he may defeat me. Then I shall be no longer my own master. He will dictate the law to me as I did to him. So this can always happen. This is important because it's as if it's like it's what I was telling you about before. I mean, the idea that it doesn't just take you're not fighting against an inanimate mass that you can poke with a stick and remains kind of just passive to it. You have an enemy that not only can strike back, but that theoretically could go on fighting even when you're too tired to do it. So you have something that can defeat you at the end of the day if you live in that condition. And this is particularly interesting because naturally there are certain real cases in which wars are fundamentally do not bring to the as we've seen to the full disarmament of one side or the other, but there are certain wars in which, you know, maybe you started with the upper hand but eventually you end up to be defeated in some way. Just think about Operation Barbarossa. Now that's a huge topic. Naturally I won't sum up my opinion on it like that, but it was like that. I mean, the Soviets went, this is debatable, but they kind of went close to defeat when the Germans swept so quickly and deeply into their own territory, but eventually they stopped them. It took a freaking long time in order to repel them, and eventually they were the ones entering Berlin. So you see how these extremes fundamentally between that exist between the outcomes of combat, in which you can't just attack and hoping okay, my attack fails, I don't have to worry about anything else. No, you have something that reacts. You have someone who strikes back and maybe manages to attack you and defeat and crush you at the end. So von Clausewitz calls this the second reciprocal action and leads to a second extreme, second reciprocal action. These reciprocal actions von Clausewitz talks about are really reflecting, or can be interpreted in this way at least, as the broader spectrum of the possibilities that fundamentally war entails. We will see how von Clausewitz dedicates so much space to the randomness of certain events, the fundamentally the unexpected eveniences that can occur in war, and especially war more than in any other field. This is what von Clausewitz tells you, because things can evolve in dramatically different ways that you could not foresee. So given that these hostile bodies, clashes, are living powers, are both living powers, this ability of attacking and striking back is always there, is always present. There is a far way every contendant can go, fundamentally. And the extreme, in fact, is the disarmament of either one or the other fighter, so the other combatant. So these are the dangers that that naturally are faced kind of all the time. Naturally, the odds can be different, the degrees of risk can be different, as it's given whichever context you take into consideration, historically speaking. But in the realm of theory, these options are always there. They're always on the table in some way. So you can easily realize how how brutal such events can turn like, and how war is such a risky and dramatic business that is incredibly you know, demanding in many ways, in psychophysical resources and much more, I would say, especially if you take it from the perspective of a single individual. Naturally, the effects of entire states that get destroyed by a war are kind of the most evident, or what comes closer to the extreme von Clausewitz is talking about. So, okay, I think for now we can stop here. This was a relatively short paragraph, and tomorrow also, I think, as I was saying before to you at the beginning of the video, I don't have so much time, so these first paragraphs are kind of good now for me to comment on, because they're small, they're relatively short, I mean, but they're so very important, so they're fine, because they don't require to me a huge preparation in order to understand every single part, but really leave a huge room for debate. But I can't be talking forever, unfortunately. No, really, I kind of like talking, but I also have an autonomy, let's say. I last up to a certain point. So for now, for today, it's all. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.